Hello all and welcome to our webinar series, Straight from the Horse's Mouth, Insights from our Experts in 30 minutes. Thank you very much for logging in. My name is Emily. I am your host for the next half hour. Today we're focusing on material circularity and what it can tell you about your products. Our guest today is Rob Johnson, Customer and Market Relationship Manager from Liberty. A very warm welcome to you, Rob, and Rob will introduce himself and Liberty a little bit more brief in shortly. And also a warm welcome to all of you. It's great to see so many interested companies in this, and it really speaks for the ambitions of industry to be on board and to get going with material circularity and adding to the circular economy. So Rob and I originally presented on this topic at the Alcas conference just over a month ago. The presentation moves between us a little bit, so it won't be just a clean handover to Rob. We'll go back and forth a little bit. And if you're interested, there's a write-up on that presentation on the Liberty website, along with lots of interesting background on Liberty's approach to sustainability. Today, we're going to be talking about a few topics, all related to circularity, an introduction to sustainability rating tools for those of you who aren't familiar with them, and then how product lifecycle assessment and environmental product declarations are applied within those rating tools, where Rob's going to give you some more detail from his experiences. We'll then introduce the Material Circularity Indicator and explain how a product material circularity is calculated, and then how it might be applied into an infrastructure project, or for that matter, a building project, but this example will be infrastructure. We'll talk about a few considerations when you're putting something into that scale, and then finish up with questions. So for those of you who aren't familiar with sustainability rating tools, there are many rating tools worldwide. The two that are most commonly used in Australasia are Green Star. There's a version for Australia and also a version for New Zealand. And then ISCA, which is used for infrastructure. So between the two of them, they cover most of the built environment, and they cover project aspects from planning all the way through to operational performance. They share an aim, which is to support a sustainable built environment, as well as the sustainability of the actual project construction. The rating tools recognise that large-scale built environment projects are long-lived and resource-intensive. So they consider the full life cycle of each project. They have their own calculators for materials, energy, that kind of thing, but they also permit the use of lifecycle assessment models to demonstrate the project's impacts and improvements against a base case. So it's flexible in how it's approached. The schemes also support the principles of the circular economy, and they reward projects that integrate some of the circular economy approaches, but they kind of stop short of really measuring how far projects go towards achieving it, which is where the Material Circularity Indicator could come in. Rob's now going to explain how lifecycle assessment has added business value for Liberty.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks again for the opportunity to once again be a horse. It's always great fun. So Liberty, I think most people on the webinar would be aware, is a manufacturer in large part of steel and steel products. We have capacity to produce 2.5 million tonnes of steel out of essentially 3 facilities. Our Whyalla Steelworks down in South Australia, Laverton and Sydney using electric arc furnaces. The Whyalla is using a blast furnace. It's been increasingly apparent to us over a number of years that we need to continually stamp our sustainability credentials for our market. And noting that we make 2.5 million tonnes of steel, roughly 80% of our output goes into the construction sector. Hence the Green Building Council and the ISCA rating tools, or the Green Star and IS rating tools, are fundamentally important to us and to our customer base. And that's been very apparent that they want to get a heightened degree of granularity of data and a heightened degree of quality of data. Hence, we've gone down the path of establishing our environmental product declarations, or EPDs, which are a very transparent mechanism of demonstrating our credentials across 13 key impact categories. Interestingly, it's been taken up so well, we've actually now in the process of commissioning our second round of those EPDs across 5 groups, essentially those groups being our Whyalla product, being structural steel and rail, and then our reinforcing products through to the mill gate. And beyond the mill gate, we've also got a distribution EPD for hot roll structural and rail, and a processing and distribution function for both our ARC business and for Liberty Steel Reinforcing. Why is it important? As I say, 80% of our volume goes into construction. We can see just how large that is at the moment. For example, up to date, in Australia and New Zealand since 2012, there's over $120 billion worth of infrastructure projects and assets that are engaged in the IS rating scheme. So you can tell from that just how important it is to constructors, asset owners, etc., that the IS rating is there. The more we can assist our customer base in achieving those points towards those scales, the better it is for each of us. From the point of view of Liberty and really the closed loop that we have, from this slide, you'll see the product life cycle, which essentially shows that we maintain control effectively all the way through our supply chain. We own our own iron ore mines in the Middleback Ranges in South Australia, which is very close to our Whyalla steelworks. We also own our own recycling facility. We produce the steel in electric arc furnaces or blast furnaces. We then produce from the steel slab or billet, hot roll structural products, rail products, and reinforcing products. Any runaround scrap that's generated as part of the manufacturing process then gets reprocessed back through that circular supply chain there. Gives you a good idea, I guess, of overall what we're able to do and why we're able to do it. In terms of the EPDs and why they're important to us, they've assisted very, very much in responding to project tender questionnaires. What is your footprint? What are you doing? How are you doing it? It facilitates early engagement on construction projects. It reduces complexity in sustainability and product footprint conversations, provides a platform for more detailed discussion with project proponents on other relevant sustainability criteria and initiatives, and positions us as being a leader in the building materials sector. Effectively, we've treated it as being one source of the truth, and it has been prepared to a recognised standard as well. Key drivers for this, as I mentioned, asset owners, government as procurer. So New South Wales government, for example, has only very recently, in October last year, released an economic policy statement about the circular economy and what they're looking to achieve there. Again, that's going to continue to drive substantial and sustainable change. I'll hand back to you, Emily, for more conversation around the MCI.
Thanks, Rob. So for those of you who are new to circular economy, you may well have seen this diagram or a version of it. The butterfly diagram, as it's known, was originally actually developed by Cradle to Cradle, but it's been adopted by circular economy proponents generally, including the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who I think have done a lot to publicize it and normalize it. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation have then gone a step further to develop the Material Circularity Indicator, which is used to measure the circularity of products, focusing on the technical cycles. So the bit of it that's boxed out. It kind of ignores the biological cycles, I think partly because they tend to be more food related, whereas once you process a material to be used in something like construction, even if it's wood based, it tends to stay within the technical cycle rather than going back into the biological side. Not entirely, but it certainly focuses on this side. So the Material Circularity Indicator is intended to support more circular design by influencing the design process as well as measuring the final result. This is what it looks like. So the process considers a product's material flows. It's the type of raw materials going in and the waste coming out. In addition, it also looks at the product's utility. That's the intensity of use of the product and its expected lifespan. Now, despite the circular economy generally promoting the use of renewable energy, the Material Circularity Indicator doesn't actually look at that. It doesn't look at energy and production or any other life cycle stages. It's purely focused on material flows and what happens to them. So the output from it is a number between 0 and 1, which is nice and simple to understand. 1 is wholly circular, and 0.1 is fully linear. So in order to do worse than fully linear, where a product would have all of its materials from virgin sources, no waste being reused or recycled, essentially going, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but going from straight through here with none of the loops around the sides. In order to be worse than that, a product would have to have a utility that is worse than the average or the standard. So a shorter lifespan or a lower use intensity, for instance. There's a lot of information that's required to calculate the Material Circularity Indicator. Looks quite simple, but isn't as well. It depends on the product, I suppose. We, within Gabi, have a Material Circularity Indicator tool that integrates the circularity metrics into new or existing LCA models, and can be used to essentially do it for you. What it does is it puts in these shadow processes, or rather you have to put them in, but it allows you to put in shadow processes that are surrounded by the dotted lines here. So for each material that's going into manufacturing, you are able to list whether it's recycled, has recycled content, virgin, reused. Same for stuff going out, same for the waste, and also input information on the product's utility. It's all parameterized so that you can reflect the specific details directly, and then also make changes to understand how the overall result would change depending on, for instance, if your steel was coming from a recycled source rather than virgin. And it then outputs a material circularity report, as well as all of the other normal indicators that you get with a life cycle assessment. And we recently added a material circularity assessment to an existing LCA for Liberty Steel. And I'll hand over to Rob to tell you a little bit about it.
Yes, this is an interesting exercise for us. We spent a lot of time and effort, as I mentioned, in terms of pulling together our EPDs in the first instance, and always hungry to understand a little bit more about what the next drivers may be. When approached by ThinkStep to have a look at the MCI for our rebar, we thought, well, we've got to dip our toe in the water and have a look and see what it actually means. So we did commission Emily and the team to do an MCI for our reinforcing bar products, and we ended up with a number, and as Emily mentioned, the number of 0.1 is pretty low and a number of 1 is pretty damn good, and our number is 0.669. So that's a really good initial result for our reinforcing bar products. As per the slide a couple of slides ago, a lot of our product is manufactured using electric arc furnace technology, which is primarily fed by scrap metal or recycled materials, but we also have a reasonable contribution from our Whaler blast furnace. So when we look at the 0.669, we can certainly see that there is an opportunity for us to improve the MCI from the fundamental point of view of just increasing the usage of materials sourced from the electric arc furnaces or the recycled content. This, as a measure of recycled content and recyclability, gives us a good indicator about where we sit. So we're pleased with the initial result, but obviously we're also pleased to know or note how we can improve and how quickly we can improve. It's certainly, as I said, a good opportunity to dip your toe in the water and see where things head, and no doubt these indicators will be taken up in both the Green Star and the IS rating tool over time. So back to you, Emily.
Thanks, Rob. So as Rob said, it's a great result, if for no other reason than it gives them a benchmark. And I think that's a really important starting point for any company, not to mention the fact that it was a pretty good result as well. So if we go from thinking about a single product, and it was quite complicated, as Rob mentioned, Liberty's supply chain is, while it's integrated, it's complex. It's not a simple A to B. But if we go from that into thinking about an infrastructure project as a product, what would that look like? If you're familiar with doing something like a rating, like an ISCA rating, we would already consider the quantity of each material that's being used within the project, the amount of it, the amount of waste that would arise from it and how it's treated, and the difference of that would give us the total project mass, in a sense. Additional to that, we'd track whether the materials were obviously virgin, reused or recycled, and the proportion of recycled content, and ideally the losses during manufacture and construction. The infrastructure sustainability tool also considers what happens to the infrastructure asset at the end of life. So it does put some of that end of life thinking into it. So just adapting that a little bit to make sure that we had all of the indicator information could work. And the life expectancy and intensity of use are fairly key information for planning any infrastructure project or building. So you can see that there's pretty good alignment between material circularity and the information that you'd need either for a sustainability rating or for a project LCA as a whole. There's a lot of overlaps, and probably easiest to manage it though through a project LCA rather than trying to pull together the data outside of that using the rating tool and other sides, because there's quite a lot going on. So a few considerations if you were to use this on a bigger scale. As it stands, the Material Circularity Indicator isn't designed to be used for infrastructure projects. There's no reason why it couldn't be, but lightweighting is not currently included in the product MCI calculations. There's good reasons for it, but lightweighting is probably a more relevant consideration for something like an infrastructure project than, say, a mobile phone, because it is one of the things that's really thought about, and it's not just about the price of the project either. Sometimes you have, for instance, higher strength concrete but less of it, or more reinforcing steel in order to manage it. So while the Material Circularity Indicator distinguishes between reuse and recycling, it then treats all forms of recycling as equal. It's not really that simple, as we know. We know that it's important to keep materials at the highest value and to consider the beneficial aspects of materials at each life cycle, as well as their long-term impact. So material circularity basically says, oh, it's been recycled, maybe it's been downgraded, but that counts. So that's something to think about in terms of putting it to use. There's also a lot of levels of detail and information, which we discovered when we applied it to a single product. Decisions about, for instance, utility or what happens at the end of life might need to be made for individual materials or for project components rather than at a project level. So in the example of a bridge, the asphalt sitting on top of it, if there is any, might need to be replaced more frequently, for instance, than the structural concrete underneath it. So we might need to have calculations at different levels that are then all sort of nested together to get the overall result. And there are a lot of aspects to calculating Material Circularity Indicator. Piecing together all of that data could be tricky, especially if not conducted through a lifecycle assessment. And lastly, Material Circularity Indicator really is only one piece of the puzzle. It calculates one aspect of a project or a product. It can fit well with sustainability rating tools, though, that consider the whole, or with lifecycle assessments and EPDs of products, where again, there's a lot of other information going on. So it's not a tool to be used on its own. Okay, so thank you, everybody. That concludes the formal part of the presentation, and thank you very much, Rob, for sharing your insights with us. We'll now move on to questions if you have any. I have already seen a couple come in. Okay, so from Peter, do I have to do an EPD or LCA to calculate the Material Circularity Indicator? Peter, no, you don't. It's entirely possible to calculate it separate to an EPD or an LCA using a spreadsheet, for instance. One of the reasons that we suggest tying it in is because I think, as I mentioned just now, it really only tells you one thing about a product. It only considers one aspect, and that makes it, well, it can make it difficult to really understand all of the different implications. So in some cases, for instance, having a higher material circularity, or more recycling, more reuse, if the materials are having to travel a long way in order to be recycled, might increase the carbon footprint and some of the other impacts. So it's really important to kind of pull it all together and not just think circularity, but what are the impacts that it's having. I hope that makes sense. Martin, so I think this is one for you, Rob, so I'll read it out. The current value to liberty of the MCI is the identification of opportunities to recover and recycle more and thereby reduce costs rather than it being driven by the market. It's more of a statement than a question, but Rob, would you like to?
Perhaps you'd care to repeat that one, Emily, thanks.
Sure. So I'm going to rephrase it as a question. So is the current value to liberty of measuring material circularity the identification of opportunities to recover and recycle more and thereby reduce costs rather than being driven by the market?
Yeah, it's certainly not about reducing costs. We recycle considerable amounts of our volume as it stands. So in our electric arc furnaces in Sydney and Melbourne, we recycle circa 700,000 tonnes in each of the facilities. So it's not about reducing costs, but it is about understanding what's driving the market. So the higher recycled content, that's certainly something we're very cognizant of. Just to put it in context, though, in the global steel market, the total scrap pool that's available is really based on the the materials that were generated 50 years ago or 30, 40 years ago, depending on the age of buildings or vehicles that are being taken to the scrap heap. So it's, that volume is not sufficient to cope for total world demand. So there's always a requirement to have virgin materials as well as the recycled content materials.
Okay, next up from Dave. Are there any extra points with ISCA or Green Star if my product is more circular? Not at the moment. So I mentioned they both reward circular thinking and approaches, but they don't really measure circularity. So at the moment, they wouldn't necessarily take the results from the product and feed it into a project level. I think it could well come. Certainly, ISCA are quite interested in exploring further how they can integrate circularity into their overall tool. And I suppose the other point of it, that the points that certainly could be achieved at this point in time would be innovation. So if a project were to look at measuring the circularity of either part or all of a project, then they would need products to already have measured their own circularity as input of data. And I think probably both tools would, from conversations we've had, would certainly reward that sort of innovation. And I suppose once it's been done a few times, it might well lead to it being integrated a bit more fully. I hope that makes sense. From Mary, and again, Rob, this one is for you. So why did Liberty go through this exercise, and was it worthwhile?
Great question. We went through the exercise. We actually did a thorough analysis on the value that was going to be attributable to doing EPDs. And the question was related to EPDs or the MCI, do we think?
I suspect MCI.
Okay. It was really that's to better understand where things might head towards and to see where we fit and to see what opportunities there are for us in the future to improve. There was a second part to the question, I think, Emily.
Was it worthwhile?
Sorry, I can't. We don't know yet. We haven't actually tested it with the market.
Yeah, it depends on the feedback we get from all of these results.
That's
right. From Nicole, this is not a question but a plea to all attendees. For Green Star, please respond to our consultation paper being launched this week and tell us how you want Green Star to respond and incentivize circularity in the future. So thank you, Nicole. I think that's an open invite to everyone to obviously push circularity. And I'm sure, Nicole, if you touch base with us afterwards, we can provide a link to the consultation paper when we send out the wrap up from this. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you again, Rob, for sharing your insights with us today.
No problem.
So we'll wrap it up there and look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.